All right, this is Gateway API meeting for January 14th, 2025. We've got a pretty full agenda today, and also want to remind everyone that we are abiding by Kubernetes and CNCF code of conducts, which largely just mean be nice to each other. One thing that can help with that is if you don't mind using Zoom's raise hand feature when you want to speak, that can help us make sure we get to everyone and everyone has a chance to participate. This agenda is for sure one that, I'll try and drop a link or someone can drop a link into chat, but it's meant to be collaborative. I think anyone can edit it. So if you have something you want to make sure we get to in this meeting or next, feel free to drop it on the list. And with that, maybe, I don't want to take too much time, but maybe leave 2, 3 minutes if anyone is new to the community or first time on the call or hasn't had a chance to introduce themselves. If you'd like to give a bit of time to introduce yourself, no pressure, but this is an opportunity.
Well, no pressure from Rob anyway. No one? No one at all? Okay.
No worries. That's all right. We can save it for next time as well. Um, all right. So we are getting awfully close to the end of what we call our GEP. I can't even remember what we call it, but it's GEP
Yep,
refinement.
scoping phase, was it?
Scoping, yeah, I don't know. But basically the idea is by the end of this, our enhancement proposals, otherwise known as GEPs, need to be finalized if they're in scope for the following release, the release we're in cycle of. So that means that we have a few things on their way to standard. Um, there's Leor, if you're on the call, if you don't mind adding a link to your conformance test PR, but there's a conformance test PR for percentage-based request mirroring. I know Leor has added it and run it against Istio and trying to get someone to run it against Cilium. I think that's the current state. I don't know, Leor, if you want to. I think you're on the call. Uh, just kidding. I don't see Leor yet, so that's fine.
I think I can.
I'm going to add the link.
I have the
I
link.
have it.
Oh, whoever that was, go ahead.
Yeah, it's me.
Awesome, thank you. Candace, I'm not sure if Candace is on the call today.
I
But
did
if
see
she,
Candace on the call.
Here.
cool. All right. Any updates on backend TLS policy? I guess this is less in the way of gap changes, so maybe this deadline is less relevant, but more in the line of conformance changes.
Yes, sorry, no changes. I will try to focus on it for the rest of the week and have some update next week.
Cool. Sounds good. And then sadly, Guy is, well, this isn't sad, but Guy is out for a great leave. But that means that policy attachment has not been moving forward. I got some time to chat with Nick yesterday, and he mentioned he was going to try and spend some time on it. So hopefully we can keep it moving. Then into experimental, there's a cores filter PR. I need to do another pass at this. I think I messed things up in that process. I want to say that this is awfully close. For anyone who's reviewed it more recently than me, I think that's at least Mattia. Uh, any thoughts on the current state of this gap?
Yeah, honestly, it has been a while since I reviewed it. I have to take it. I have to take another look at it.
Okay. Then listener sets. I know several people. So Dave pinged several people yesterday to take another look at it, and I know at least Nick and myself took another round of review. I think it's worth some discussion. I think Nick summed it up very well in this comment that there are at least 3 open items. One, will this start in a separate experimental API group? I'll save that till later in the meeting because that's kind of a bigger can of worms. Will we make port optional in the listener set version of listener? My idea is that as long as we have a very clear and well-defined path to supporting all ports on a single listener, I'm okay with whichever path we choose to start with, as long as we have a path to supporting all ports on a single listener. And then the parent ref or singular, multiple parent refs or not, really depends on your perspective of what the common case is for listener set. Is the common case a controller is creating these and it's all automation that runs listener set, in which case you probably are fine with a singular parent ref. If on the other hand, you're imagining that this is a user-facing API, then you would expect, or I would expect at least, that this would mirror a route and have multiple parent refs. That's just my take on this. So I see there's been some more comments since I've reviewed this. So if anyone else has thoughts, I don't know if Dave, I know Dave wasn't sure if he was going to be able to make today's meeting. Looks like he's not. So yeah, anyone else has thoughts on this one, feel free to jump in.
My thoughts are that I just added something to my calendar to do a bunch of GEP review.
Cool. Thank you. And then
I'm seriously way behind on these, and I'd like to apologize to anybody who's put in the effort of writing GEPs. Not that I think anybody was specifically hoping for me to review them, but
yeah, I mean, this is
actually, I take it back. Auth in particular and retry budgets both were specifically flagged for me. So Mike and Eric and Nick, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think you're not alone in that. I would say I also have been owing a lot of people GEP review, and have high hopes for the coming couple days. But yeah, completely get it. The next one, I think I actually saw Eric or Mike on the call. Am I imagining
Yeah, I
things?
think it's just me.
Great. Any updates or thoughts? I noticed this is still a draft PR.
Yeah, only a minor update. I addressed a couple of things that got brought up in the discussion around this last time I was on the call, namely like the TLDR I provided for this gap. But I'm still maybe waiting for a review on what I have here so far, and since Mike is not on the call, I think I'm gonna try and sync up with him offline this week. Just because I know we weren't fond of the idea of doing this via policy attachment last time, and I think I might need a bit of guidance with someone from someone with a bit more experience with the API as far as how we might expose this. Just because my initial thoughts, I don't think they're gonna work out.
No, thanks. This is great. Have you already? I've lost track of this one. Do you already have? It looks like you have. Okay, you've looked at Envoy and Linkerd in particular as implementations of budgeted retries. Maybe for anyone, including you on the call, are there any other well-known implementations of budgeted retries, or are those the main ones?
I think
I
those are
searched
it.
around. Yeah, I searched around. I didn't see anything else, but if anyone knows of anything, that would actually be helpful. But right now I just think it's these two data
Okay.
plane implementations.
And
I looked
do
around.
both?
I looked around at this also when we were initially talking about retries for routes at all. And at that point, Linkerd was the only one that did it, that had done it for any, significant amount of time, and it had just recently been added to Envoy. So
Oh, wow. Okay.
I think that those two are still it.
Yep. Got it. And well, maybe this will help encourage more. Where, at what level is this config usually attached? Is this attached usually at basically
Okay.
service or cluster level in Envoy,
Sit.
or
Sit. Okay. Okay.
I can't tell if Thomas is trying to answer the question or if Thomas accidentally unmuted.
yes,
In
Okay.
Linkerd, you can associate retries. I'm going to mix 2 bits of Linkerd here, so apologies for that. But broadly speaking, you can associate them with services and also with routes.
okay.
There
So
are a couple of places where Linkerd has been changing the world to allow you to do things to a service so that you can get all the traffic from any meshed workload going into the service, but also let you tune it per route.
The retry budget though, can that be tuned per route or is it?
The retry budget cannot currently be tuned
Yeah,
for
okay.
route, and I'm using currently judiciously there because there's some work going on in Linkerd that might allow that, but I need to talk with engineering about it. Envoy is weird. Envoy implemented retry budgets through their circuit breaker mechanism, and I think you have to associate. I think circuit breakers operate on Envoy clusters, don't they? Do you remember, Eric?
Yeah, it's at the destination.
Yeah. You can, since Envoy's config is crazy, you can, of course, configure multiple clusters for the same backend service, and that gives you a mechanism by which you can configure an Envoy to do per route circuit breaking and therefore per route budgeted retries. I don't know if, say, Istio actually does that or not, but it's possible.
Well, yeah, well, Istio doesn't currently expose retry budgets, and that was actually something I was trying to contribute to Istio along with many others, but they've been holding off on it until there was consensus with how it's going to be handled within Gateway API.
yeah, that makes sense, and this is a challenging one. I know many it would probably be worth doing some kind of survey of the many Envoy based implementations of the API to see how many do kind of the unique cluster per time a route is targets a service versus reuse that cluster for every single target. When I've looked into it in the past, it's a scalability nightmare if you start creating clusters for every single time a route targets a service. But if people have, accomplished it well, that's a good signal more broadly. So maybe worth a bit more discussion there. But with that, I know there are lots of things on the agenda, and I want to make sure I'm leaving time for that. Thank you, Eric, for taking time for this. I would recommend, I think, at first glance, I know you still have some to-do items here, but there's enough in here that's worthy of a review. So I think it's fine to mark this as not a draft now.
Okay.
And that hopefully will attract a bit more review as well.
Great. Okay, cool. I'll do that. Thank you.
Also, Rob, I'd like to thank you for demonstrating that I'm not the only one with that recovery code warning from GitHub.
Oh, that's awkward. That's funny. Next one is Nick's auth PR. I am trying to remember. Is anyone? Yeah, it looks like we've had a few reviews.
Yeah, there have definitely been some comments on that.
Yeah, and I noticed he pushed an update as recently as yesterday. Mike, not to put you on the spot, but you're oh, no, Mike's not on this call. So we'll leave it there. But reminder, this exists. Nick is pushing it forward, and we're making a best effort to squeeze this in to the current release, but reviews will help us get there. All right, so let's talk about timelines and things, because that seems important. Next week, in the US at least, many will be out of office on Monday, which is our next scheduled Gateway community meeting. Nick, as many of us know, is based in Australia and doesn't really care about US holidays. And so he'll be there. He will be around to run meetings. I have heard that those kinds of meetings are actually really great, usually a smaller group and more interactive discussion, and just whatever you want to talk about. You've got great access to at least one gateway maintainer to jump through any in-depth topics or whatever is on your mind. So there will be a meeting next week, is all that says, but expect the attendance to be lighter. On that same line, when we had this bright idea of the GEP phase ending the day after a US holiday, we may not have thought that through that well. I know a couple maintainers, including myself, spent a fair amount of this time dealing with internal escalations, which you can probably read about. With that said, it's been a thing. So I am not suggesting that this should be a common or regular or even occurrence ever again, but we are proposing that we push the date back from January 21 to January 30. So that's a very significant pushback. I do not anticipate this happening again, but let me just be clear. All right, I'll add it out. It will end on January 30, which is a Thursday. This will be a firmer deadline. But the rationale for that is, well, I kind of mentioned it, but we have a lot of huge gaps in this cycle, and I'm hopeful that giving another week or thereabouts will give us a clearer chance at getting some of these in. And this is a bit more a recognition that many people have been on vacation or will be on vacation. So, yeah. With that, Pooja, you have a topic that I am excited to see more about. Let me add you as a host, and you should be able to present. But I know many people, including myself, want to hear about cluster IP gateways.
All right, let's do it. So yeah, cluster IP gateways. I have circulated a document on the Slack channel, and I'm hoping to follow it up with a GEP PR, or at least gather feedback on that document. It is mainly geared towards defining via documentation how one would achieve cluster IP service style functionality using Gateway API. And then it does touch upon a few extension points in order to, try and achieve this functionality. So just really quickly, obviously this has been talked about in the past. Is and on a more broader term as to whether Gateway API can be thought of as a replacement or a substitute for Service API into the future. We all know that Service API is the oldest API in Kubernetes, and over time, a lot of things have been added to it, some of which may or may not belong there, or have sort of muddled their meanings over time. There's a lot of underspecified semantics, so implementations have varied widely. But anyway, I'm not going to dwell on that. There is an amazing lightning talk by Tim Hawkin from one of the past KubeCons that covers all of this. And even if I tried, I couldn't so effectively and succinctly capture something like that in 5 minutes. So not attempting that at all. But the bottom line is that both Service API and Gateway API provide ingress points to route traffic into pods, and Service API has over time, uh, you know, uh, has had some inflexibilities, and whether Gateway API can be seen as decomposing the Service API into separable components, such that the areas of concern are sort of separated out, or separation of concerns happens, and there's more flexibility and more power. Just to quickly map the cluster IP address and the listener configuration of a cluster IP, Service API could map to a gateway resource. This is just high level mapping. Uh, and the type of service, whether it's cluster IP type service or a node port type service or a load balancer type service, the implementation for that particular type of service and the configuration related to that can be captured by a gateway class resource. And the nitty gritties of routing traffic to the backends obviously maps to the route resource here. For us specifically, we really needed to have, we really ran into some issues with the inflexibilities of Service API when we were trying to support some of our multi-network use cases. These are some of our customers that are kind of like government customers who have strict regulatory and compliance requirements and require multi-networking inside their Kubernetes clusters, and also require complete network segmentation and traffic isolation among these networks. Also, telco customers who run specific infrastructure and software on their data centers, and require similar things, pods to attach to multiple networks, and then complete traffic isolation among those. Um, and Kubernetes, as we know, natively only understands the default pod network, doesn't have support for natively for multi-network use cases. That's a separate effort that's ongoing as to how to best bring that into Kubernetes, or maybe even as an extension. Um, but we ran into issues where our customers basically wanted to have cluster IP services hosted on their secondary networks. They wanted their cluster IP addresses to come out of a completely separate service sider that was in the network range of the secondary networks. And today you can only specify a single service sider in Kubernetes. So there was not really a good way to support that unless we resorted to some inelegant or kludgy implementations, where the ideas being thrown around were to have a mutating webhook that would intercept requests for cluster IP allocation before it gets to Kube API server, and we do our own thing there. But anyway, it was all sort of kludgy and did not fly. Mainly because Kube API, inside of Kube API server, the IP address allocation and the service definition is so tightly coupled that it was hard to achieve this using the Service API as it is today. So Gateway API offered a very streamlined and clean way for us to be able to provide this functionality on secondary networks for our customers. And I wanted to sort of lay that out, really. This kind of just shows how one would map a service CR onto Gateway API CRs. The type of service, as I mentioned before, whether it's cluster IP or something else, and the implementation and configuration related to that would map to a gateway class of that type. And then the IP address, the port, the protocol would reside inside of a gateway, and the listeners on the gateway. The target port of the service CR, which is the ports on the back end, maps to the backend ref ports on the routes. And then as far as the pod selector on the service CR, which is responsible for selecting the backend pods for a particular service, we introduced a custom CR here called endpoint selector, for the lack of a better name. But that CR basically is uh, provides a selector based on which you would select the resources to attach to the backends. Uh, I know there have been discussions in the past around whether the backend refs on the route for having different kinds than just services to attach to the backend refs on the routes. And this seems like maybe a good evolutionary point to consider a more generic resource like endpoint selector that sort of allows any kind of a backend to attach to a route based on selectors and such. So wanted to bring that up there as an extension point. And then another extension point that we had was we had to use a custom route. We could have used a TCP route or a UDP route the way it is right now, but we wanted to sort of not complete parity, because a lot of it kind of doesn't make sense, but we wanted to provide some parity with all the additional service API features that are available today for cluster IP services. For example, session affinity, internal traffic policy. And that was the main reason why we had to use a custom route. We have a config section. I'll show an example, but we have a config section inside of our custom route to be able to specify these features. And then I quickly wanted to talk about DNS as well. This is not necessarily an extension point, but something that would need to be done if one were to do cluster IP gateways. Today, when you create a cluster IP type of service, Kubernetes creates a DNS record for that service so that the pods inside of the cluster can address that service using a DNS name instead of just the IP address. And cluster IP gateways would need something similar to happen as well for them if they need to be used in a similar manner. So again, first extension point, as I said, endpoint selector. This is just a quick example for that. The backend refs have a kind of endpoint selector, and then endpoint selector for us, we had a pod kind there, and the selectors here would specify a key value pair based on which the backend pods would be selected. Oh, and this one, I wanted to resurface this out there. There have been discussions in the past around how when, dealing with Gateway API, we are, especially in our case, from a single service CR, we are moving to around 3, potentially 4 CRs as far as Gateway API is concerned, that the customer would need to create and maintain, and whether these can be somehow merged and consolidated in order to reduce the complexity and the maintainability burden when using Gateway API. And I think one of the most recent discussions was in context of listener sets that had come up, and there was an idea floated around whether backend refs can be attached directly to listeners. And I think it was an either or. One could have either allowed routes or backend refs. And for simple cases, the backends could attach directly to listeners. And then for more advanced routing and load balancing cases, one could still have allowed routes and attach routes. I wanted to sort of resurface this mainly because when discussing some of the Gateway API designs and stuff with our customers, this was one of the concerns that kept coming up as to, hey, whether can you have less CRs here for the Gateway API? And so I thought this would be a good time to sort of bring this up. And then this is the example, as I said, of our custom route. And we have a config section here that really was used to implement the additional service API features that we wanted to support with our cluster IP gateways. And then DNS, as I said, today when a service is created, a DNS record of the format service name .service namespace .service .cluster domain is created by Kubernetes in core DNS. For Gateway API, the GIP proposes a similar format, of course, open to suggestions, and wanted to know thoughts. So please feel free to comment on the doc or on the GEP PR when I create one. But a DNS record of the format gateway name.gateway namespace.gw.cluster domain, which would result in the following additional search domains to be added to the pod's resolve conf. Basically the same lines as service. There would be a pod namespace.gw.cluster domain and gw.cluster domain. Anyway, I don't want to open a rat's nest here. There is a discussion around additional DNS lookups and
Too late.
Load opened it and load on core DNS increasing more so with IPv4 quad records and lookups and so on. There is other things like node local DNS daemon sets that are being proposed for node local caching of DNS records to mitigate that. But anyway,
Wait, did
closing up the
I?
rat's nest. Want to move on to the. I'm sorry.
Sorry, you cut out from me. At least it may have just been me. So ignore me. And
It was not just you.
okay.
Oh, okay. All I said was I'm closing up the rat's nest. It was very important.
Cool.
You can try, but once it's been opened.
Hotel California.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
uh, wanted to bring up and touch really briefly on cross namespace referencing. Gateway API allows gateways and routes to be in different namespaces, and that's one of the great flexibility points that Gateway API brings for something like a cluster IP type gateway. Today, when you create a cluster IP type service, the backends are required to be in the same namespace as the service. I don't know if reference grant can be used there. Anyway,
It
again,
can.
another. Okay. But so yeah, by default and in a standard manner, mostly the service backends need to be in the same namespace. And if we and the question is whether cluster IP gateways should either restrict the cluster IP and the gateway, cluster IP gateway and the routes, and hence the backing pods to be in the same namespace, or would that just be a recommendation, and then customers can do something funky if they wanted to with it. Uh, if we allow cluster IP gateway and routes to be in different namespaces, there could be some ambiguous cases. I was able to come up with one, and even that, if we consider Gateway API as replacing all kinds of services, may not apply. But for headless services specifically, for headless services, I guess in Gateway API world, you would have a completely separate gateway class and implementation for that. So it may only apply to that. But today in Service API world, cluster IP and headless and all of those are conflated enough that today when you create a cluster IP service, a pod DNS record of the format pod hostname dot service name dot service namespace dot svc dot cluster domain is added for the pods. And if we do something similar for gateway, which we may only need to do for headless services now that I think about it, there might be some ambiguity in what namespace should be put there. Would it be the pods namespace, which is the same as the routes namespace, or would it be the gateway namespace? And something that would need to be discussed and talked about. Um, Again, may not necessarily apply to cluster IP because with Gateway API, those concerns would be separated. And then this is just a non-exhaustive laundry list of additional service API features that I wanted to list out here. Each one of these maybe probably needs to be individually discussed, um, but wanted to bring some that when one moves to Gateway API, it becomes separate enough that may not even make sense. For example, external IPs field of or external IP feature for cluster IP services, which allows one to expose the cluster IP service on an externally facing IP address. And once that is specified, then the external traffic policy starts applying to the cluster IP service, which normally wouldn't apply. Um, but with Gateway API, if load balancer gateways and cluster IP gateways and headless gateways and node port gateways are all going to be separate, some of these probably don't even make sense or don't need to be supported. Um, Again, like I said, today when you create a load balancer service, there's a cluster IP service and a node port service created automatically in the back, and so a lot of these sort of get their meanings muddled, which we may not need to do when doing stuff with Gateway API. But again, food for thought. Or wanted to open it up for discussion as well. And also some of these features here need to be discussed because some of them clearly belong at the route level, but then there are some that can maybe be at the gateway level or route level, and we don't have extension points on the gateway level. So how one would deal with that? The one that I could think of right now that makes sense to have at the gateway level maybe is the publish not ready addresses, where basically the pods that are not in the ready state can still be added as the service backends. Um, Not sure of the use cases for some of these as well, but again, I wanted to open it up for discussion. And then just like cluster IP gateway, like I said, the it can be extended to support different types of services. Node load balancer services, node port services have gateway classes corresponding to those. Probably headless services, external name services, which really just provide like CNAME mappings and such. And yeah, I think that's all I have. This is all in the
Yep.
GEP. I thought running through the GEP would be a little bit more confusing, so I just really created slides of exactly all those things.
This is awesome. Thank you so much for presenting everything here. I know it's a huge effort, and this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. But I'm excited to, I feel like everything about this is really, starting to push on L4 in general, in an area of API that has been neglected, that certainly needs some attention. And so I'm excited to see that happen. Obviously, like your presentation shows, and your gap shows, this is a huge amount of work. And if we're going to be successful, we need to cut it up into, small chunks that are achievable independently. Like I imagine if we're going to run with this, we probably need to, have intermediate deliverable things, because we're going to end up with, Kubernetes core integration to support cluster IP gateways in terms of DNS, in terms of kube proxy, those kinds of things.
You end up with core integrations pretty much right at the beginning if you, especially if you want to arrange things so that there's a migration path and you need to be able to replace the controller that's monitoring services, right?
Yeah. So, I think services still have to exist. This is more of a bolt-on on top, right? So it's more.
Then you're not going to have a migration path, and you need to have a way for services to cause these additional resources to come into existence.
Right. So this is we should maybe leave a couple minutes for comments, but I know there's a ton left on the agenda, so I will cede to anyone who has thoughts here. Dia?
Yeah, I do have a question. Thanks for the presentation. It was very interesting. Something that is not completely clear to me is what's the actual proposal here, because you built something with what we already have today, right? With all the flexibility and extension ability of the Gateway API, you built something new. So what's the actual gap? Is it like kind of recommendation on how to build something like that? Is it kind of you want to standardize your GK route? What's your what do you have in mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I kind of struggled with that as well when I was creating this. The gap mainly aims at, and I've seen some gaps in the past doing this, wanted to lay it out via documentation how one could achieve cluster IP service style behavior using Gateway API. And as far as standardizing, one of the big things that I wanted to bring up is the endpoint selector resource, which is more of a generic resource meant to attach to the backends, because today the only standard thing we have attaching to the backends is the service, and which is really definitely what we want to move away from for this case. And then also wanted to lay out how one could think of DNS in such a case when they're trying to achieve something like this with it. And then wanted to obviously open it up to a more like in the future replacement discussion. But the gap really is, if you look at the issue that I've created, and the goals and the non-goals of the gap are, is to define via documentation how one would do this, and then talk about the extension points, because the Gateway API documentation clearly says that if you have any extension points, the community would want to know about it. And I thought that endpoint selector was the one that definitely could be talked about as far as upstreaming or standardizing. Custom route, I wanted to sort of lay it out there. I don't have it on the gap. I can add it there, but that was more around how we wanted to implement the additional service API features. But if you have other opinions there, I can definitely add it there.
I think the idea of the endpoint selector resource is really interesting. I would be a lot less favorable towards a GKE route resource.
Yeah.
Yeah, plus one.
I mean, I wouldn't call it GK route if I put it in the gap, but yeah.
Just saying. You know.
But maybe like a config section in the route type
I
thing.
think a config section in the route would probably be a
Yeah.
good idea, although that itself is a deeply fascinating can of worms. But splitting the endpoint selector and maybe DNS machinery into separate GEPs feels like a kind of an obvious thing to do.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Into separate gaps by themselves. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. Well, the thing
Well,
is that endpoint selector, to my way of thinking, there's some utility to endpoint selector totally irrespective of whether you do new gateway types or gateway controller types or anything like that, right? The
Yeah.
idea that you could say, hey, this route targets a batch of endpoints and we don't particularly care what services are in front of them. It's kind of interesting, right?
Yeah.
Likewise, I have long wanted the ability to interact with DNS in Kubernetes via a sane set of APIs as opposed to breaking open the covers on core DNS and mucking around with things that nobody in their right mind should muck around with. So, yeah, that would be interesting.
Yeah. Makes sense. Does it still make sense to still have I don't know, a memorandum kind of a gap to
yeah.
like,
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I didn't
okay,
mean to. Let me phrase that differently.
okay,
The memorandum gap laying out how you would expect the pieces to, or laying out a way in which you would expect the pieces to fit together makes a ton of sense to me. To Rob's point, trying to deliver all of this at once is likely to be less than practical.
yeah,
And, the endpoint selector feels like a good component to split out. I should also point out that historically, the idea of using a gateway to replace a service has been a little strange to me. In my head, services and gateways are not quite the same thing. It's very difficult for me to articulate why I believe that and in what way they are not the same. Um, I do feel that if there's interest in trying to do this sort of thing of, oh, let's just kind of use Gateway API to sort of edge sideways into taking over a service and making it better, it will be necessary and not at all optional to have a way that a user can create a service record and then the right things that are Gateway API resources appear underneath for the Gateway API controllers to do the right thing. I think that if we don't have that kind of a migration path, any such effort is doomed to failure.
I think I do want to do a time check here. Let's make Candace the
Yeah.
last question, and then we'll keep on moving. Candace? Or
I
comment.
I mostly wanted to point out um what the conversation that Grant started in chat, Pooja. I really liked your presentation. And it's a little bit, all of it's a little bit over my head at the moment, but I just had one suggestion related to Grant's gap about backend LB policy, which includes some configuration for session persistence. And I thought it might be possible to remove the custom route in this proposal by repurposing the backend TLS, backend LB policy. And there may be, so in other words, there may be other ways to configure what you need to configure in that custom route.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. We may not need a custom route per se. Sorry, Pooja, I should let you respond.
yeah. No, I think that's a good point. I didn't see the chat messages. I was just going through that right now. But that is a great point.
Cool. Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you. I am looking forward to more discussion on this. Thank you for the doc. For anyone that missed it, the main thing in the agenda is for this item is a link to a doc that I think will eventually turn into a get, but right now it's meant, sometimes it can be easier to get a first round of comments via doc, so we're not overwhelmed with hundreds of comments on a GitHub PR. So yeah, add your comments here. I think this is really well written, and we can run from that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. The next one on the agenda, I was looking through the current attendees on the call, and I think it may be nothing because I don't see Augusto or Mike on this call. Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, so I'm not saying we can't get to it, but I'm gonna move it to the end at least. So then that means we'll jump into, that's another can of worms. So I'll leave my next
You have
item
9
for
minutes,
also
Rob. Good luck.
later. Yeah, exactly. So maybe what I think is easier to accomplish is a heads up that last week we did the 0.1 review for Gateway Inference Extension. The expectation is that V0.1 of this API and this extension and the whole thing will be released at some point this week, knock on wood, but hopefully Thursday. That's tentative goal. We'll see if we manage to make that work. For a little bit of fun, this is going to be a SIGs.k8s IO when DNS is propagated, but we have some docs, and some of you may remember this this fun little icon, logo, whatever. This was a runner-up for what was going to be the gateway. It was Flynn's favorite, but it has been usurped for the purposes
favorite for some terrifying value of not at all favorite in the least.
Yeah, but it has returned for better or worse, and I think my personal bias is it fits better for inference anyway. So yeah, that's that. Mattia, let's talk about the gateway survey.
Yeah,
this was very cool.
I guess I should share my screen. Can I?
Yeah,
Thank you.
how about it?
Here it is. Okay, is it big enough?
Maybe make your window smaller. Yeah, that's better for me at least.
Better? Okay. Yeah, we just closed the survey like yesterday. Yes, we got 95 answers to the survey, which is a good number. Honestly, I didn't expect such a number of answers. I shared here in the document the Google Sheet with all the raw data. All of you can access this sheet. You can just take a look if you are interested. My plan is to go through this document in the next days and try to extract some kind of structured information, because I know that this is kind of pretty complex to read and to go through. But yeah, it has a lot of good suggestions, points to talk about. So I really hope I will be able to write a detailed document for the next Gateway API meeting. But for now, I guess that we can just quickly go through the data here and to see what are the data that I deem interesting somehow. I think that this one is the first one. Basically, we get we have 44% of people who are not using Gateway API in production, and yeah, almost 56 who are actually using the API production. I think this is not a great number.
Seems like a realistic number, though.
Yeah, looks so. A very interesting point is that our Gateway API tooling is not really used by almost anybody, because we asked something about how people migrated from Ingress to Gateway API, if they use the Ingress to Gateway, and basically there was a fair amount of people who migrated from Ingress, but basically a very few of them used the Ingress to Gateway tool, and mostly because people don't know that Ingress to Gateway doesn't know that Ingress to Gateway exists, and the same for Gateway Cattle. Oh, sorry, this was for the Gateway Cattle, and this is for Ingress to Gateway. So basically, from this first raw data, it looks like we have to push more for our Gateway API tooling in documentation, because people are not aware of them, which is interesting. Another data is the usage of Gamma. Gamma is used by 20% of people, mostly because people doesn't really use service mesh, but also because they don't know about the Gamma project. And this is the almost 25% of answers of why you are not using the Gamma project. A good bunch of people use the experimental channel, slightly more than 40%. And here is a section
Wait,
related
I'm sorry.
to
Could you back up a moment? So
Yeah,
the
sure.
majority are using standard, but
Yeah.
okay.
But I mean, this is a good number. 42%
That's
of people is a
yeah,
good
that's a
number.
really interesting split.
Yeah. I
don't
didn't
do-
expect this number, honestly. It's
Nor did
higher
I.
than expected. Yeah. So here is a list of questions related to the experience of updating the Gateway API, how happy you are with the current feature set, with upgrading, and this kind of questions. Basically, to the question, what's your experience with updating the Gateway API? The result is that it's not that bad, because people have no complaints, and it's okay, but could be better. But I mean, it's not terrible. We have like 3 people over 95, which is a good number. Here are a lot of detailed answers related to why people are happy or unhappy about the upgrade experience with the Gateway API. Then here is the routes that are currently used by people. Of course, the first one is HTTP route, but this is very curious because a TLS route and TCP route are used more than gRPC routes. So it's an interesting data point to me.
Yeah, it's surprising to me, but good
It's
to
a little
see.
less surprising to me because gRPC route kind of just came into its own. The one
Sure.
that really surprises me on this chart is UDP route, actually.
Right. Yeah, that's got to be some kind of sampling. I don't know, but good
That
for
feels
the
like a
people that
sampling
are.
error somehow.
Okay, so this is what's the most painful friction point as an application developer? 25 people say that's great. 20 say that it's complex to configure the routing routes as they want to. 24, they say that, okay, it's hard to figure out which gateway I need to attach my routes to. And other 20 people say that documentation is not good enough. And
Well, that's
a
a
point,
nice bit of validation.
yeah, exactly. And documentation is something that pops out from time to time in the answers, here, up and down. So I think it's a pain point is a hard word, but I mean, it's something that we have room for improvement for sure. And this is another interesting point. So in which L7 route, in which routes less than L7, so TLS, TCP, or UDP are you interested in? People look very interested in TLS route and TCP route, and UDP as well. But this is kind of the follow-up from the other question, which was which routes are you currently using? So people are interested in TLS and TCP route. So here is a bunch of how happy are you with the UX? Pretty happy with the current feature set. Pretty happy again, not that happy like with the UX, but yeah. A thing that popped out many times in the feature set is the lack of authorization. People really want authorization. Many answers were related to auth, which is good because we are working on auth. So hopefully we will be shipping auth soon. And here is a bunch of other answers. As I said, I really hope I will be able to wrap up this huge document and write a consumable document soon. As a final point, I wanted to highlight this answer, which is great because we have to increase the number of annotations on gateways. We really have to.
Fortunately, that won't be hard because increasing from 0 is straightforward.
Exactly.
Nick will just love that answer. Need to make sure we share it with him.
You never know.
Yes,
Nick might have written it.
Fair. With that said, we have gone over time today, so thank you everyone for the good discussion. We should stop it here, but thank you, and yeah, lots of follow-ups from this one. But
Rob,
talk to
since we're already over, can your xkates.io API group, is your follow-up basically saying we should bloody well do this already, or is there more subtlety to it than that? Okay.
Yeah, not even that, but so far I haven't had anyone push back on that discussion. So I am pushing ahead. I'm just gonna assume speak now, forever hold your peace, but otherwise it's just gonna happen. So
well, that we should, I think, talk about it in a couple of weeks back in this slot, but
yeah,
as much as I hate it, I think it's the least hated one possibility so far. Yeah.
Well said. Cool. All right. Well, have a great one, everyone, and see you in a bit.
Happy New Year, all.
Cheers.
Likewise.
Bye.